Immortality is the subject, and the Bible has a lot to say about that. So it is very, and a very attractive concept, isn't it? Many people have searched for this over the years. We often don't hear the Juan part of his name, but that's the full name. In 1513, Ponce discovered what he thought was the fountain of youth in, of all places, St. Augustine, Florida. And we went down there a couple of years ago with my brother and his wife, and we looked for the fountain. Ponce de Leon is not alive today, so we are pretty sure that was not the fountain of youth. But the search continues, and today, in the United States alone, over $50 billion are spent on anti-aging products. Here's the fountain that he was convinced was the real thing. But time waits for no man. You recognize who this is? Maybe you can read it there. This is back in his younger days, and he doesn't look like that anymore. Not even for a 72-year-old kid. But other people are convinced that the cure for aging is just around the corner. And Raymond Kurzweil is one of them. And he is convinced that nanobots, are the solution. These little miniature machines which will be deployed into the bloodstream of those who have organs that are in need of repair, and they can do on-spot correction and potentially achieve an indefinite lifespan. Well, the Bible tells us that immortality comes from the Lord. Love the Lord your God, Moses reminds us here in Deuteronomy, and obey his voice, for he is our life. That's where immortality comes from. It comes from him and the length of your days. Well, let's see how things have changed. Things are looking up, and over the years, this comes from the CDC, Center of Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, where we hail from. And they published this recently. It's called the History of Average Lifespan Table. And as you can see, things have poked along pretty much as they always have. 30, 40-year average lifespan throughout for long periods of Earth's history. But there's been a dramatic upswing in the beginning of the 19th century, 19th, 20th century. Hygiene started improving. Then the invention of antibiotics, that made a big change in life expectancy. And in different countries, you can see here, United States, even across a couple of centuries, 37, 47, 68, 77. That's where we're kind of crouching in on 80 now as the average. And the World Health Organization announced in 1980 that one of the scourges throughout a long time now, smallpox, is eradicated, officially off the face of the map. Some confidently anticipate that there will be actuarial escape velocity. As that thing is going up, eventually it's just going to go right off the chart and we'll be home free. See, that's the plan of these people that have these ambitions for building what sounds to me like another Tower of Babel. But some people, in anticipation of this, are already paying lots of money in their endowments or estates or their wills, and they've got themselves on ice in the deep freeze. This is a cryogenic chamber, as you can see there on the side of it. And they are awaiting the day when cures for all these things have been found. But is there a cure not only to aging, but for dying? Well, there was. There was at one time a tree of life on this planet. This is not it, as you can probably see from the little animals carved in the side there. That's from Disney World. Disneyland, Disney World. And in Genesis, however, we're told about the tree of life. Chapter 3, Genesis 3:22. And the Lord God said, Behold, the man has become as one of us, to know good and evil. And now lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. That was what would have happened if the tree of life had remained accessible to us. Therefore the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from whence he was taken. Apparently God wanted Adam and Eve to live forever. That was plan A. And God provided them a means for this to happen with the tree of life, right in the middle of the garden. God warned them, however, not to eat of another tree, which was also in the middle of the garden. Genesis 2, verse 17. The both of them were right there in the middle of the garden. You didn't have to go off somewhere to find the tree of knowledge and good and evil and get into trouble. It was right. They were both together in the middle of the garden, it says. But there is no record that God encouraged them. He warned them about not eating the tree of knowledge and good and evil. But did God ever encourage them to eat of the tree of life? Was there instruction? Was there a command to eat of the tree of life? Not that I could find, or is there? And God said, Behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed, which is upon the face of the earth, and every tree in which the fruit of a tree yielding seed, to you it shall be for food. Genesis 1:29. So there was a command. Eat of the trees that have seeds and fruit on these trees. Trees and the fruit of a tree bearing seed. Seed bearing fruit trees. That was the command. Well, we've expanded our diets quite a bit since then, but seeds actually have in them all of the ingredients, everything necessary is the source of life for producing another tree. And of course, that's true for all plants, right? The tree is in the seed. That's what we usually say. We hear that. But what do? We throw away the seeds. Generally, we dig the seeds out and throw them away. Eat the fruit. Paul in Galatians, remember, noted that there was a promise of God was to Abraham and his seed, which is Christ. Jesus, the Son of the living God, the Word that was with God in the beginning, is the life of every man. In him was life. John 1, verse 4. He is the way, the truth, and the life. John 14:6. He is the resurrection and the life. John 11:25. And this is the record that God has given unto us, eternal life, and this life is in his Son. So there's a real connection. There's an intimacy between the Son of God and eternal life. And that's how God is giving that life to us. It is through his Son. He is the bread of life. We talked about that this morning. Come down from heaven. Every man who would eat thereof will not die. John 6:50. He is the real tree of life. You remember Jesus referred to himself as a tree on his way to Calvary carrying the cross, and the women were wailing and crying, and he said, "Don't cry for me. If they do this to a green tree, what will they do to the dry?" Why was Jesus a green tree? And who are the dry trees? What is a dry tree? It's a dead tree. A green tree is a live tree. Jesus is a green tree. He is the source of life. Let's see here. There's the seed. You ever done that? Who hasn't done that? My son did this, and then when it got a nice root there, he stuck it out in a pot, and it's growing. It was about last time I saw it when we were over at his house. It was getting up a pretty good size avocado tree. Well, here's something that we were pleased to be able to take a picture of a couple of years ago. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 generations. This is our grandson on the end here. He's 13 years old now. Yeah, some years ago. A dozen years ago. He's at least a year old there, I think, maybe. And our daughter, and then there's Carolyn, her mother, and her grandmother. And grandmother died 5 years ago? 6 years ago? 107. So we have, at least Carolyn has. I'm going to try to have it rub off on me. You know, she's got it in her genes for a nice long life there. There's the boy. But this is what happens, right? Things change. And we have time as a, they call it an arrow, the arrow of time. Psalm 90, the days of our years are 70. What's that, 70 years? Oh, you beat that. And if by reason of strength they be 80, yet is their strength labor and sorrow. For it is soon cut off, and we fly away. Verse 10. That we're flying away. Okay. Well, the wise man, and Ecclesiastes chapter 12, describes this process. Keepers of the house tremble. Well, you start getting unsteady on your feet. Balance becomes a problem. Falls are the most common cause of demise in the elderly. So, man, I don't know what you need to do. Get some kind of training wheels for. Keep yourself from falling over, because broken, hips, subdurals, fractured ribs, all kinds of things happen to elderly people who fall. Keepers of the house tremble. Strong men bow themselves. We start walking, the spine starts to curve. You get that kyphosis in the vertebral column. The grinders cease. We start losing teeth. And that's going to affect your nutrition, certain things you can't eat any longer. So it limits your choices. The windows are darkened. Vision starts to, 40. It was 40. 40 years old. I had to start looking around for one of these things. I had been hooked onto them ever since then. Carolyn got a nice fancy lens implant. But yeah, you can see the whole thing, but I want to do that. Small things become a burden, and desire shall fail. But it doesn't have to. The silver cord is loosened. Silver cord is talking about the spinal column. And if you have collapse of your spinal cord, and it starts pinching nerves, and you can get numbness and then paralysis and weakness and neuropathies in the lower extremities, to start with anyway. And the golden bowl is broken, the pitcher is broken, the wheel is broken. There's a lot of cerebral vascular complications that happen. Elderly years, you're at risk of stroke. If you fall, I mentioned subdurals before, all the kinds of things can happen to the brain. Well, there's all these risk factors are in our environment, and some of them we have control over. We don't have to expose ourselves to certain poisons, things that have adverse side effects. How many people are on medications? I review medical records every day, and it is just amazing to me. People in their 60s, sometimes younger than that, but often in the 60s, and they're starting to show up. They're on the Medicare rolls, and so they're coming into the hospitals now because it'll pay for it. And they've got a drug list that's 20, 30 drugs long sometimes. I just am appalled. And it starts out with one or two, but they cause side effects. So you got to have something else to cover the side effects. But they have side effects, so you got some more to cover those side effects. Oh man, it's just an unending, vicious cycle. But cigarette smoking and cigars and pipes, you don't have to have that. That's a choice. Even the pills. But then there's some internal factors. These are risks as well. And so genetics is something we may not have any control over. Folks like the nanobots come to the rescue and fix those genes, reorder those pairs on the DNA and get us back into shape. That's what we need. Well, it says in Hebrews 9:27, it is appointed man once to die, but after that, the judgment. By one man, sin entered into the world, and death by sin. The wages of sin is death. Romans 5:12 and 6:23. Theologically, the explanation is based on the consequences of Adam's choice when he decided that he could be his own God. You shall not die, he was told. At least Eve was told, and she bought that. Biologically, however, there's mounting evidence that we are programmed in our DNA to die. Each cell has built-in kind of preset counter that prevents immortality. And it's called the process of apoptosis. There's a diagrammatic blow-up of an electron scanning microscope of a cell. And we've cut away, and you can see some things inside there. Apoptosis, apo, is one of two Greek words. Apo means from, and ptosis means to fall. Now in medicine we talk about what happens to people that get myasthenia gravis. Their eyelids start to droop, and we call that ptosis, PT, ptosis. Their eyelids kind of sag. It's falling. So apoptosis is what happens when the leaves fall off of a tree or the petals fall off of a flower. It falls from the tree. It falls from the flower. But in living cells, apoptosis is programmed cell death. It has its beneficial effects, and in development, in the embryo, then there's beneficial apoptosis that takes place selectively in certain areas, so that the hand that comes out as just a mass of cells starts to divide, and the cells will disappear between the fingers as they separate. And we can see this happening in fetal development. So, although this whole process was recognized, first described in 1965, today we know that there is more to it than just normal embryological development. We have 50 to 70 billion cells every day that die. And some of these are necessary, and they're being replaced, and that's good. So as long as they're being replaced, no problem. But how many times can you replace the same cell over and over? And you have to have a balance between losing cells and replacing them. What happens if you replace more cells than you lost? Yes, that balance is called hemostasis, and there's an in vitro microscopic fiber optic view of a fetal hand. Apoptosis and homeostasis is the balance. So if you have too much, you want to have just as much proliferation as you have atrophy. If you have too much proliferation, then you have cancer. That's right. Or other localized problems such as psoriasis. You have buildup of skin, and pretty soon you get many layers, or keratosis, and these things that start build up on your skin, around your neck. skin tags and all these things that overproduction. If you have too much atrophy, that can be a problem too. And what happened here? We go, the macrophages. These cells are what help clean up the ones that are dying. So as they're dying, they're being replaced. These come in and scavenge. They clean up. They're the garbage collectors. And there are certain chemicals that are produced in the cells. The DNA, at a certain point, after so many cell divisions, it says, okay, chemical signal, a cytokine is produced, goes out, and it says, macrophage over here, time to go. It's the body's police, and so they take the bad cells off and execute them. However, they also tell normal good cells when it's time to die as well. Even if you've got a one that's changing and it's going to become cancerous, this macrophages will take care of the bad ones. But the good cells obey the law by responding to their own internal clock, involuntarily making a noble sacrifice to die for the sake of the whole. Now, this language is something that the evolutionists will throw in there. They're going to say, this is for the good of the weak must sacrifice for the fit, survival of the fittest. In John 11, after Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, the Pharisees got together and they plotted the Savior's death. One of them, named Caiaphas, being the high priest that year, said unto them, "You know nothing at all, nor consider that it is expedient that one man should die for the nation." There's this idea that for the sake of all, we'll have one die. And this he said not of himself that year, but he prophesied that Jesus should die for the nation. And then John comments, he says, and not for that nation only, but for the whole world. Well, we can see this in action in the laboratory. This is a yeast cell, and these little bumps, the little blue bumps around the edge there, are called bud scars. Every time the yeast, and you know that yeast cells will divide and separate, when they do that, the point where they separated leaves this little bud scar. So how many times is this separated? Well, there might be one or two hidden on the other side, but we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 at least, maybe 7 or 8 on there. And the number of times that a cell can divide before it dies, as it's seen here, is a model for aging. And there's some folks that have actually counted, well, how many times can they divide before they quit dividing? And this was done by Leonard Hayflick. And he found that yeast cells could bud about 10 to 30 budding divisions. It's called the Hayflick limit. And he has extrapolated this to human cells, which he has proposed that we should have, theoretically, a lifespan of 120 years. Sounds good to me. I'm middle-aged. A little over middle-aged. I'm on the downhill side now. But Moses was 120. So he lived to be that long. He based his figure on the number of times that the human cells can divide before they stop dividing. Now, one of the things that controls this, they've located where in the DNA sequence, which is when it's all coiled up, forms the chromosomes. And the ends of the chromosomes, and I've colored them red here, are areas called the telomeres. And it's in this area where the sequence, the DNA sequence, occurs as the DNA is being transcripted and the RNA is moving along, transcription RNA, tRNA, and it gets down to the end, sets a counter. Okay, next time he comes back, next cell's going to divide, it comes down here, sets a counter. What it does is it chops off a little piece of that each time. And when the counter's used up, then it won't divide anymore. Telomere is gone. So these help, during the time they're still present, they stabilize the DNA molecule and allow it for complete replication. Once it's gone, it can't get to that's the end of the line, and these get shortened each time a cell divides. So they've been called, that section of the chromosome, they're kind of white, very bright here, are called the youth genes. And these are where they produce histone proteins that help repair the DNA code. And if you've got errors in transcription, they'll go and find it and correct the error so that it prevents mutations. And when the telomeres shorten too much and they quit functioning, of course, then and these become fragments, it won't divide any longer. Now, one of the things that causes cells to break down, even when they're normally dividing, is free radicals. And these are a problem in a lot of areas, in a lot of tissues. We think of, in atherosclerosis, the free radicals affect the lining of the arterioles, our arteries, the intimal lining, the very thin lining on the inside. And free radicals can damage that, punch little holes in it. Well, what's a free radical? This is two atoms, and we have a plus sign in the nucleus of the atom, and negative sign for the electrons that are in orbit around the atom. Now the outer shell, the outer orbit, I've only just drawn the outer one here, is filled up. Its full complement of electrons is 8 electrons. So we've got 2, 4, 6, 8 in each of the rings there. A free radical is one over here who is missing one of his electrons. Now he's electron hungry. He wants to fill up his ring, get 8. I want 8. 7 won't do. I got to have 8. And so as he comes nearby another molecule that has an atom that has electrons, it will, like a magnet, just pull that electron, rip it right off that other electron. Well, when this happens at the molecular level and these things are sucking electrons off, it damages those molecules. So if you imagine a molecule on the lining of your blood vessel wall and it's got electrons being ripped off, it's going to change the structure, the electrical properties of that molecule. It separates, it becomes charge unbalanced, and will allow things to happen that wouldn't have happened otherwise. It would have been protected. Now it's not because of the free radicals. So there's how that works. Now, free radicals have their most paradoxically are produced in the mitochondria. The body creates these as part of the electron chain process and oxidizing glucose and the glucose to make energy to phosphorylate those ADP molecules into ATP, just a double to a triple, where you've got some energy for the cell. Those electrons that cause all these reactions to happen produce free radicals. Now, we can have that protected. It can be quarantined. It can be held within the cell safely if you've got enough antioxidants available to prevent this. So there's where we have some choices. All this in the environment. When we showed a picture of the cigarettes before in the environment. But we also have other things, other factors, ionizing radiation, ultraviolet light, which is a form of ionizing radiation. You have all these things from pollution in the air, which changes charges in the molecules in the air. Inflammation, another oxidative process, and of course in the mitochondria. All of those things can have effects on the DNA and cause damage to it, and not only the DNA in a cell, but the cell walls as well. So one of the things that can help us, because of the mitochondria, which is part of making energy, one of the things that have been discovered, and we're going to go into more detail in the next presentation, is to regulate how much energy are we making. Do we want to make too much energy? Because it's going to have this side effect. And it'll have some damaging effect if we make more than what we need. It's like overcharging your batteries, boiling off the water. Well, let's take a look at life expectancy around the world. Here's a map that I found that shows different regions, and they're color-coded. It's very pale, so maybe you can see that. The purple areas, United States is one of those, Australia, most of Europe, and Argentina, looks like, are in the 75 to 84 year average lifespan range. So that's pretty good. They're up, that's the developed part of the world. What do you call those? First world nations? They never say first world. We always talk about third world nations. Who's the second world nation? I never had that identified. And so the orange ones, Asia, Africa, Middle East, Mexico, parts of the northern parts of South America, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, some of those areas, 65 to 75 range. And then you get the yellows, 50 to 64, 40 to 49, pale yellow, and then less than yellow is white. And a few areas on the map still show some of those as well. But one of the things that have been identified is that there are some extremely high lifespan pockets in the world. National Geographic recently, in 2005, their November issue of National Geographic had a magazine article called The Secrets of Living Longer, and they identified 3: Okinawa, Japan, Sardinia in Italy, and Loma Linda, California. So we're on the map, folks. They call these the blue zones. These have the octo to 100-year-old centenarians, the centenarians, 100-year-old people. The one thing that they all 3 have in common is they are plant-based diets. For the most part, those that live the longest have plant-based diets. So, let's add to our list. Remember this one at the very beginning? All Adventists. 85 years. That's what the Adventist 2 study is reporting. We've demonstrated that regardless of your diet, if you're an Adventist, and it's probably because of the other factors, no smoking, and the general other healthy lifestyles that we emphasize and promote. So it's not all diet, but there is an advantage of having an all-vegetarian diet, and that adds a couple more years, 87 years, to the lifespan. We're going to now look at what we can do to lengthen our lives. We've seen some of the factors that affect it, and there's some more that can be done. Luigi Comaro, back in the Renaissance, 1550s, the Enlightenment, people were starting to pay attention and observe and test, hypothesize, and form theories. Well, Luigi had a theory. He was only 37 years old. No, 37 years after Ponce de Leon in 1550. 37 years after Ponce de Leon found his fountain of youth, Luigi Comaro discovered the secret of long life, and he wrote a book about it. This is his book. And he called it The Art of Living Long. It was the result, and he describes in his book what he had observed in his own life. Now, at the age of 35, that was close, 37 years after Ponce, but he was 35. He was suffering from a lot of diseases that he didn't think he really should have been having. I mean, 35, well, now let's think back. What was the average lifespan in the Middle Ages? It was about 40. So he's starting to worry. I'm getting up there, and everybody else is dying off about this age, a little older. But he was concerned about it. And he had gout, arthritis. He was having infections in his skin. And he decided that he was going to cut back on how much he ate and see if that might have something to do with it. Because he noticed that other people who were having these similar problems appeared to him to be eating more, and he thought maybe the clue or the solution was eating less. So he decided to limit his intake to 14 ounces a day. Well, you want to very carefully select your food if you're going to only have 14 ounces. And he nearly eliminated all flesh foods. Lived to be over 90 years old. That was unbelievable in that time period. In the 1500s, 16th century, people just did not live that long. So he was a record breaker and wrote a book about it, told his experience. Caloric restriction, that was his insight. Now, there is a problem with toxic wastes, and there is a solution to overnutrition. Today, everything is big. It's getting bigger and bigger. We started out, we had 8-ounce cans of soda. Now you can get the 2-liter bottles. And it's not just a Big Mac, it's a double Big Mac. And what's this one? 1, 2, 3. 3 of them in there with everything else in between. Well, these can cause, and everybody recognizes the problems that this has brought upon our populations today. Degenerative joint disease. Now, part of this is because directly what we eat can get deposited in the joints. When you get too much of something, where's the body going to put it? And it'll stuff it into the joints is one of the areas. Sometimes it tries to get it out through the skin, and so you get all kinds of eczema and skin problems, and psoriasis. But degenerative joint disease can also be just because of the bulk and the extra weight, it puts more stress on those weight-bearing joints. So hips, knees are the ones that really start giving out lower back problems. Hypertension. We know that that is directly associated with extra body weight. Why? Because for every pound of adipose tissue, the body has to add another so many hundreds of yards of capillaries and blood vessels to supply all that tissue. And when you have many, many of those pounds, now we're talking about miles of extra pipeline that the blood has to be pumped through. Well, that puts a real load on the heart. And so hypertension is a direct result of all that extra tissue. It has to be pumped and supplied with pressure. You know what happens when you have a long hose out there? It gets a trickle at the end. And that happens in our bodies as well. Cardiovascular disease, same, all that pressure back on the heart gets large, it starts stretching. The valves, which normally would have been tightened together, now as the heart's getting bigger and the valves can't reach to close, you start having insufficiencies, back leaking of the blood. The pump doesn't work as well anymore. You have heart failure. Diabetes. Everyone knows that there's a strong association between, as we mentioned in the previous presentations on diabetes, and the BMI, the body mass index, parallels directly the risk of diabetes. Fatty liver disease. Now, fatty liver used to be seen only in alcoholics, but we're seeing it in people who have never touched a drop in their life. But if they've got a lot of extra nutrition and their liver is overtaxed now to try to metabolize and take care of all that and process all that those extra calories, fatty liver disease. 80% of overweight people suffer from it, and about 2% of those you can actually develop non-alcoholic cirrhosis. And somebody who's never drank any alcohol at all, cirrhosis, hardening of the liver. And of course, all of this shortens life expectancy. Well, there's been a number of experiments that have helped us really demonstrate and see how this can actually happen. Of course, the experiments always happen in rats. What's the number one cause of mortality for rodents, rats? Lab experiments. Yeah. In 1934, two experimenters, Mary Crowell and Clive McKay at Cornell University, conducted one of the first modern experiments to demonstrate this, that severe reduction in calories, but with adequate micronutrients, demonstrated lifespans up to twice normal. So in 1986, this was repeated. Folks had discovered this old experiment, and they said, "Does that really work? Let's see if we can reproduce this." And so Walford and Weindrich replicated the same experiment, came up with the same results, and they reported that if you reduce the calories in one group of rats, but you fully feed the others, the lifespan indeed will double. Not only does the lifespan lengthen, but the activity levels and the fur, the pelt quality is noticeably different. Activity in the cage, as they observe them, they seem to be much more active. Now this has been extended to primates. That's getting closer to home. Yeah, we're kind of related to these guys, they say. Here's two of them, Kanto and Owen. They're both about the same age. Kanto's 2 years younger, 27 and 29. Now, these are rhesus monkeys, and 3 years after Waldrich's experiment, this was conducted at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, Wisconsin. And they demonstrated that a significant reduction in age-related disorders, cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and brain atrophy, all way suppressed in those who had less than full diet. Now, you can visibly see some difference between these two characters as well. Though the lifespan for the rhesus monkey is about 40 years, we're only a little over halfway through the experiment here. So not all the results are in, but it's early enough that even though we're past the 20-year point, 80% of the unrestricted diet monkeys in the control group, in the caloric restricted group, I'm going to get the numbers right in the right group, 80% of the caloric restricted group, that's the one that Kanto's representative of, are still alive. But in the unrestricted diet group, of which Owen is modeling for them, only 50% of the controls are still surviving. So we've got a 30% mortality rate already demonstrated in the unrestricted diet. Well, what does that diet look like? Let's take a little closer look. Not only can you see in their faces and in their bodies, Kanto walks upright. He's got an elastic skin. He's energetic. Owen is hunched over and sagging skin, much less active. Kanto eats nearly half the amount of food that Owen does. And if you can see that, 445 calories versus 885. But they also each receive an apple a day. So that's good. Now, if we translated that, because these are just, monkey pellets or whatever they give them, but if we made it look like what we fed, and they don't feed them this, but this could be translated into a sample meal. For breakfast, they'd have fermented soybeans and garlic. At lunch, tofu, honey, what in the world is that? And carrots, konnyaku, some Japanese dish. And for dinner, vegan sausage, kale, tomato sauce, and salad. Okay, sounds pretty good. But Owen, this is kind of what he would have gotten. A lot of cooked stuff there. Well, what about humans? Okay, we've done this in rats, and we've done it in monkeys, and what about us? Well, in 2002, Washington University, they tried to see what would happen, at least in measuring triglyceride and cholesterol, blood pressure, fasting blood sugar, and just the BMI, which is strongly correlated with body mass index, strongly correlated with diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, a whole lot of things. They all have the same slope. It goes up, they go up. So they had a 10 to 25% less calorie group, those that could eat anything and everything they wanted to, and then those who reduced their calories just by 10 to 25%. It wasn't even half like Cato had, half of what Owen had. And their total cholesterol and the LDL cholesterol, that's the one that we want to see reduced, was 10th percentile. That means it's way down here. If you got, here's everybody's cholesterol in all groups, 90% percentile is way up here, 10% cholesterol, the percentile is way down here. 1/10 of the whole range. That's where they drop. That's amazing drop. HDL, that's the one you do want to have high, was way up at the top, 85 to 90 percentile. Triglycerides, that was even more impressive, 5%, way down at the bottom. 1/20th of some of the people it would be on the top. Blood pressure, 100/60. My, a lot of people would pass out. They had that blood pressure. They stand up. 130/80 was what the average in the other group. And fasting blood sugars dropped 65%. BMI dropped by 6 kilograms per meter squared. So that's very, very impressive. In a 6-year study, this began in January 17, 2006, reported it actually, in the Journal of American College of Cardiology. They had 25 individuals from 41 to 65 years of age, and they followed them for 6 years. And total intake was 1,400 calories a day to 2,000, 1,400 to 2,000 calories a day, compared with a match control group of 2,000 to 3,000 calories a day. So now that's not quite a 2 to 1, but maybe a third less. And echocardiograms. Now we're looking for, how does this affect cardiac performance and health? And echocardiograms showed a lack of declining diastolic function with age. Now, I already tried to to demonstrate that with my hands because of the valve changes and the size of the heart. And that is what they were going to track. They're going to measure this by doing echoes on their heart. The caloric-restricted group had valvular and ventricular performance equivalents of those 15 years younger. So if you looked at their echocardiogram and said, man, that looks like a 40-year-old, and you compare the 65-year-olds over here, and so there's the real age spread, but those who may have been 65 chronological years old had a heart that looked like a 40-year-old if they were in the caloric-restricted group. So here's an echocardiogram. That's kind of what they look like. And you can see the valve leaflets flopping around down there in the bottom above the ventricles. So bang, 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 flapping back and forth, flapping. The nutritional sweet spot. This is what we want to shoot for. We want to strive for that ideal. Because what happens if you restrict your calories and you restrict your calories and you restrict your calories and pretty soon you're not eating anything? You know, the fellow that had fed his dog sawdust. He's going to save some dog food. And he decided, I'm just going to save a whole lot of money. I got all this sawdust out here, and I'm going to feed him sawdust. And they said, you can't feed a dog sawdust. He said, well, he wouldn't eat it either for a long time. When there's nothing else around you try anything. And he was doing really well. And then he died. He just up and died. So You don't want to be way out on the end of this graph. There's an ideal spot that's just right, the Goldilocks zone. And I've jumped a few. However, caloric restriction, you don't want to be so far out at the extremes that you're either running off the end into starvation and undernutrition. Neither do you want to be overdoing it on the other side and overnutrition. So there's this ideal spot right in the middle when we get just the right amounts. And so one of the things that can works very effectively, and this is another study that showed that alternate day fasting is just as good, just as effective as doing it every day. And so improved, and this was reported by Dr. Mattson, Mark Mattson, chief of the National Institute on Aging, Laboratory of Neurosciences. And they were following the effects of diet and particularly calories. If you do a search for caloric restriction in the internet, you find all these studies and more. And they were wanting to track it. Well, how's this going to affect neurodegenerative disorders like Parkinson's and Huntington's, chorea disease, and Alzheimer's, and so on? And they were studying this in mice, and fed the two groups, the low caloric diet and everything they wanted to eat, put all their food out there and let them eat everything they wanted to. And they had a third group, which they would allow them to eat everything they wanted to one day and then restrict it the next day, and back and forth. 24 hours, deprived, and then the next day have the full access to their mood. Both methods improved glucose metabolism and increased insulin sensitivity, resulting in lower insulin levels and increased stress resistance. And that appeared to have some real protective benefits to the neurons. And they were looking at neurodegenerative disease. So they're looking at neurons. How's it going to affect the cells in the brain? And so doing this every other day worked just about as good as doing it every day. Well, we have certain things that we pay attention to. And one is the quality, not just the quantity of food, but the quality. There's a economic efficiency, however, in eating foods that have good they're high, nutritionally dense foods. They've got everything you need in a small package. And because you don't need to eat as much of it, and you get all you need. So on the one side, it may taste real good. Some of these very flavorful these chips that come with all kinds of coating on it that zing in your mouth, and but it may have a low nutritional value. So you find yourself having to eat a lot of these low nutritional value things because you're not getting what your body needs, and it's starving. It's hungry for real nutrition. And so you're eating a lot of quantity. What have I heard? A large quantity of mediocre food. But if we have nutritionally dense food, less can actually be more. And that's really what we want to work for. Of course, the miracle of the manna. We talked about this earlier. The Israelites complained that they had no bread. So God gave them manna, the corn of heaven. Psalm 78:24, the corn of heaven. And each man gathered according to his eating, says in Exodus 16:18. That was how much? What did they do with it? Oh, they ground it, and they baked it, and they beat it, and they made cakes, and they cooked it. And if they kept it overnight, it had bred worms and it stunk. And they ate it, huh? Extra protein. But on the Sabbath, There was no cooking. No fires were kindled. Day-old manna gathered the previous day saw no corruption, no fermentation, no spoilage. Day-old manna, unprocessed, not baked on the Sabbath, was still as fresh as the day before. There's both a spiritual and a nutritional lesson in this for us. Moses said that God gave them manna to teach them that man does not live by bread alone. Deuteronomy 8, verse 3. And Jesus repeated those words because he gave them to Moses. Manna was not bread, but the people turned it into bread. They refined it. They processed it. The natural angel food into man-made food that couldn't last overnight. Is that why it spoiled? Maybe. They weren't allowed to, they were able to cook fires. They could bake it and do all those things during the day, weekday, and it would spoil. On the Sabbath, no fires. So it was live manna, raw manna. But in its natural state, it was preserved without going bad. Huh? Miracle of the manna. And of course, Jesus also had not just bios life, not suken life. There's 3 words in the Greek language for life. He had zoe life, eternal life. And that's the life he wants to give to us. So if we are cooking all of our foods, and we showed this in the other lecture on what happens when you heat foods too much. And I suspect that the lack of enzyme activity from heating foods and eating too much cooked foods is one of the causes for diabetes. Foods, the natural foods, before they're cooked, have in them the enzymes necessary for digestion. When we cook them, and the enzymes, they're proteins, just like all the other proteins, the heat denatures them, they fall all apart, they lose their shape, they're not going to work anymore. Now your body has to come up with the enzymes to digest the food. It puts a real load, a real demand on the pancreas, salivary glands, to produce all these enzymes, and it can wear them out. And same thing happens to fats and sugars, which we mentioned. And I'm going to advanced glycation end products. That's what age is. And the R, rage, you see the rage tissues there, that's the reactive advanced glycation end products. So this is what happens when you overcooked starches. They caramelize, they start turning into plastic, and they're not digestible. But the body's got to put them somewhere, so it starts depositing them in the eye lenses, the retina, the macula, joints, arteries, and causes all these diseases. Systemic acidosis reduces antioxidant levels, deactivates enzymes, produces nitrosamines. If you've got, this is in meats primarily, which have been treated with nitrites to keep them looking nice and red, so they don't turn brown. And when we cook them, then they turn into nitrosamines, which are carcinogenic. And heterocyclic amines, that's what happens to the fats when they're exposed to high temperatures. Even corn oil, it doesn't have to be animal fat, it doesn't have to be lard. Corn oil in high temperatures, recycled. And they put those fries in there and put another batch in, and they don't change the oil. It's heterocyclic amines. And acrylamide, it's actually another structure, a chemical that's produced with high temperatures and reduces protein digestibility. Well, as we mentioned earlier, in the blue zones and those areas of the world where there are people that live to be 100 years old, we have 80,000 in the U.S. alone, and it's growing. It's a growing number. 600, in fact, are over 110. The oldest, 115. So there's long life strategies. And basically, we've got 2 things. Avoid the bad, emphasize the good. So we don't want to have too much nutrition. We want to think less may be more. in many ways. Toxic exposure, fresh air, pure water. Animal protein, not as good as plant-based live food. Stress, we want rest, meditation, and sleep. That's why we're all here on this Sabbath day. And inactivity, exercise. Get outside and get circulation moving. Indoor living, outdoor sunlight. God's ideal for the human species. Biblical rest, best of breed, evidence-based creator's cuisine, and death-defying dining on the divine diet. I like that one. Original recipe. What was it? What was the original recipe? You just pick it right off the fruit, off the tree, off the vine. Instant food. It's even better than fast food. Just pick it and eat it. Isaiah 55, verse 2. Why do you spend money on that which is not bread, and your labor for that which does not satisfy? Hearken diligently unto me, and eat ye that which is good, and let your soul delight itself in fatness, in richness that God designs for us.